suppose I'm interested in forms like science fiction or ghost stories, either in literature or in cinema. I mean, I think partly because they're pulp categories, so they're kind of degraded or vulgar, kind of artistic or kind of creative forms. And that's one of the things I'm interested. I mean, in a way, when I started making video because it wasn't the language of cinema, which isn't the case anymore, right? You know, the medium is used for cinema. I wanted something that wasn't dignified. I wanted something that was dirty, that all the shit stuff, all the kind of the grubby stuff of moving image is also done in. And I guess that's one of my interests in those kinds of forms, science fiction and ghost story. But also these are forms which in themselves kind of can admit by their very nature almost anything. So the ghost stories particularly, you know, a kind of complex, porous threshold between life and death. And, you know, so they break open categories and they merge them, or they confuse the area between them, and science fiction does that in a similar way. And I think, you know, that's something that I'm really interested in relation to, you know, some of the long-standing concerns I've had in terms of making video about thinking about how knowledge is, or areas of knowledge are separated out and distinguished, you know, either in kind of academic disciplines or say within museum collections. Areas of experience and knowledge get kind of separated out, and I'm always interested in where they cross over. And I suppose those forms particularly lend themselves to a disturbance of categories, and also they lend themselves to surprises that, you know, I mean, I suppose one knows in a ghost story one is going to be surprised, but they, in a sense, they admit irrational things or improbable things or supernatural things that are, you know, technically impossible, and science fiction similarly. But they're always related to our understanding of what the rules of the conditions of life and death are, or of, you know, organic growth are, say in science fiction. They're always related to our understanding of rules, but allow a certain kind of play with them to admit other things and other possibilities that may surprise. Since making video, I've always been really fascinated by the relationship between the computer cache, the area of storage within the computer, and the timeline where I compose the narratives. And, you know, in the sense that I have all these materials and I build videos with like thousands and thousands of files. Some videos have like millions of files because of CGI, and yet they're very short. They're these 10-minute, usually quite condensed things. So I just have become really interested in the sense of this dense, invisible area of storage. I think it relates to my interest in archives and collections, where, although they may be publicly accessible, you only get to see the surface of them or selected elements. And also the idea of, you know, physical storage, the kind of the idea of physical waste, or the bits of storage or repositories of things that that we wouldn't want access to, that are kind of marginalized. And of course, increasingly, computer data is stored in things that have like immaterial names, like clouds, but of course they're like in great big warehouses, you know, located on ring roads somewhere, you know, with exhausting huge amounts of resources. You know, they're physical, literal places. They're just somewhere else. So there's this kind of relationship between a narrative or selection and this other material somewhere else has become really increasingly important to me to try and find a way. I suppose what I'm really interested in is trying to find a way to express the pressure of that material on whatever the surface is, which could be the surface of a video or a kind of political surface, or, you know, some kind of idea of good manners or something, you know, just the sense of this stuff pressing against it. So in the two videos I've made for the show, that's expressed in different ways. One is a science fiction story. It's called Felt Tip, and it's about an emerging technology of the possibility of storing digital files in DNA, which is possible, but hugely expensive, and the DNA has to be, wouldn't be living. But in the case of the video, it's a science fiction story, and so there's this idea that administrators of the future are employed as almost like physical mules to bear the files, the intellectual information of their employer in their DNA. And so their own bodies become a kind of repository for this information that in some instances they do not have access to themselves. And in the other video, coal is about, in a sense, the residues, the cultural residues, what's left over from the history of coal mining and particularly from the end of coal mining. So although most of the architecture that was visible of coal mines has been removed in this country, all the subterranean architecture remains, but is now flooded. And I was just really interested in this idea of this groundwater returning and flooding through this network of tunnels as some kind of analogy for the sense of, in all the ways that the history of coal mining lingers and it is not going to go away, both in terms of the political legacy of the abandonment of whole communities to the environmental impact of it, the sense of... So the idea of, I suppose, the storing coal is, the sense of deep repositories, geological repositories, but also deep cultural and social repositories, and but also long, I guess, of course, the history of coal and the history of coal mining is possible because of environmental events millions of years ago, and so you have this sense of this very deep time and this repository bringing, causes having effects after a long delay. And I suppose one of my interests in coal is the sense of the unfinished political business around the conclusion of coal mining. I think I use quite a wide range of photographic, digital and reprographic technologies. I think partly because my interest in making moving image, I think, comes out of perhaps a history of publishing as much as it does out of a history of moving image itself. And I think, in my videos, there's generally a short story or a social history, which is often accompanied by, really usually still images. And the moving aspects are often the text itself or some of the transitions. And so I think my use of digital is always in relation to these kinds of different histories of technologies. And I think I'm interested in digital technology as the kind of place where all these prior technologies wash up: phonography, the recording of sound, moving image, in terms of cinema and film, and also publishing. These, historically separated, institutionally and technically, kind of processes are possible in on a laptop. And so I guess my interest in the digital is where materials produced in those ways wash up and end up. And in a sense, how the descendants of those institutions and those technologies now occur in the digital. So it's this place, for me, it's this heterogeneous place where these different things can happen. And I think I use things like CGI, I think, in very limited ways. They're never, in my films, they never comprise all of the material. And I think I often use them to express certain fictional aspects or kind of imagined aspects about the work. I have, in each of the films, there are narrators. These narrators are usually expressed graphically with text. Sometimes they're audible, but when they're audible, it's synthetic voice. And I've often used CGI in a way to extend the idea of these narrators who are never straightforwardly kind of human. And so in the films that I'm showing here, I use CGI to give some kind of expression to them through this imagery of legs, which walks around from projection to projection. And in relation to the photographs, I think how I ended up making these pinhole photographs is partly because I'm very, very interested in, you know, often my videos feature analog materials. So when I started making them, I was thinking about making them as materials for video. But I mean, in some senses, my medium is projection as much as it is kind of editing on a laptop. And, you know, I try and use projection so that, you know, where I use a projector, it's the only light source in the space, and all of the information streams out of the projector. And in the light of that information, you may see architectural things and environmental things, but there's something about the projection, the light emitting from the projection, and the issue and the potential of scale. Most of the subjects in my videos are actually quite small. They're little photographs or little artifacts, and I use projection to give them something like a physicality equivalent to the human body. And I think with the pinhole photographs, they're basically made using projection in my studio. So I project a light from behind through a stencil I've made, which is a kind of collage stencil. And in that way, you get the light shines through, and you get some of the information about the print technology that was used. You kind of get some of the texture of the print technology of the mesh, but also the texture of the paper. And so these kinds of physical things are, you know, through the projection are kind of captured photographically. And once again, I have the potential through the exploding the scale to sort of create, to indicate in a sense what's happening through the process of projection, that your relationship, you know, to these kind of minor, I mean, I'm always really interested in minor social histories and kind of parochial materials, that gets reorganized through the process of really straightforward literal enlargement, but also what becomes visible in the process of enlargement.